Good evening, witches, wizards, and gender non-conforming magical folk. Welcome to my class on magical media criticism. Tonight's lesson subject is everyone's favorite boy wizard turned cop, Harold Potter. But before we get on to our lessons, I need your help. My finances have been hit with an Evanesco vanishing curse, and the only way to undo it is for you to like, subscribe, and tinnitus that bellis, so I get all those advertising and YouTube premium knuts. And if your parents happened to die and leave you with a fortune in Gringotts, you might also consider throwing a couple of gold galleons in the coffers over at patreon.com/littlehoot. So now that I'm done panhandling the students, let us begin. Harry Potter is a global phenomenon and massive franchise of films, games, books, stage plays, merchandise, and theme park attractions based on a 7-volume series of young adult novels first published between 1997 and 2007 by Joanne Rowling, aka Joe Rowling, aka Robert Galbraith, aka J.K. Rowling. The series follows the titular Harry Potter, who is plucked out of misery and obscurity and sent to a magical British boarding school for witches and wizards, where he makes friends, discovers his innate talent for wizard football, and fights Wizard Hitler. The media narrative that immediately cropped up around Harry Potter around the time of its release was that of, these are the books that are getting kids to read again. Bloomsbury Publishing bought Rowling's manuscript for the first novel in the series, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, after Nigel Newton, the head of Bloomsbury, saw his 8-year-old daughter finish one chapter and want to keep reading. There was also a media narrative around the book's author, J.K. Rowling, whose journey from penniless divorcee scribbling chapters of her novel on napkins to the world's highest paid author seemed to mirror the Cinderella story of her series' lead protagonist. And according to her biographer, Sean Smith, this media narrative and publicity made for very effective marketing. It's hard to describe to people who weren't there at the time what a cultural juggernaut Harry Potter really was. I mean, I get that it still is, but at its height, it was akin to nerdy kid Beatlemania. It was certainly the first time I had experienced anything like that in my life. The series of books has sold more than 500 million copies and has been translated into over 70 languages. In the US, the first 3 books in the series occupied the top 3 spots on the New York Times bestseller list for over a year until they created a new list for children's books and moved them over to that one. Kids would camp outside of bookstores dressed in costume waiting for midnight release parties where they could be the very first to get their grubby little hands on the newest entry in the series. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were like rock stars. They were bigger than Jesus. There were people who hadn't read a Harry Potter book, but they were like those people who hadn't seen Star Wars or Game of Thrones. Like, at a certain point, they were just avoiding Harry Potter to seem quirky or have something to talk about at parties. The original series of novels also came out at a time when the internet was really just taking off and before the advent of social media. And fan sites like Muggle.net and the Leaky Cauldron became their own kind of cultural behemoths and compounded the series' success. Pottermania was real. It was intense and it was enduring. It certainly died down a bit after the release of the final novel in the series, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, but the fandom and general goodwill towards the series carried on at least until the completion of the film series in 2011. There had always been some criticism of the series by other authors and literary critics who mostly accused it of being conventional and derivative with clunky prose, and there was an early minor backlash to the Harry Potter books from conservative Christian groups that really only served to promote sales of the book. But a real turning point in the public perception of Harry Potter came in the mid to late 2010s and early 2020s, after the author's behavior on a certain social media platform drove her audience to begin re-examining her work. If J.K. Rowling's personal politics were so reprehensible, fans wanted to know, is Harry Potter bad? So I want to discuss some of the more troubling aspects of the wizarding world. But there are some common criticisms of the series that feel very lazy and pedantic to me. They feel like a filler on a 2010s era BuzzFeed or Crack.com listicle. And so, in the interest of being fair and balanced, I want to take the opportunity to dismiss some of these more shallow criticisms of the series. The danger and mystery of Hogwarts is a feature, not a bug. It's a running joke among Potter fans and non-fans alike that there's no health and safety at Hogwarts, and students are always getting injured or killed there. And I don't think it's a children's book, don't take it too seriously, is a good enough argument for most of the series' problems. But in this instance, letting the main characters run around almost entirely unsupervised in a haunted castle full of monsters and booby traps, getting themselves into real danger is like part of the fun. And I'm glad J.K. Rowling didn't try to write some kind of wizard OSHA to address this particular bad faith criticism of Hogwarts. The wizarding world is supposed to exist parallel to the non-wizarding world, which is itself pretty patriarchal, especially in Great Britain. So I think criticizing wizarding institutions for not having gender parity or whatever is sort of invalid. There's definitely a conversation to be had about the ways Rowling fails to critique that institutional sexism and the ways her particular brand of liberal, not like the other girls, feminism is lacking and tinged with a fair bit of its own sexism. But to criticize the wizarding world itself for being a mirror to our own, I think is to misunderstand what the wizarding world is meant to represent. Why do they put all of the evil kids in one house? Hogwarts houses are designated main character kids, evil kids, smart kids, and miscellaneous. Yep, it's set in a high school. You've got your central cast, your nerds, your preppy rich kids, and your stoners. Next. A lot of people have taken issue with Harry's close relationship with Dumbledore, determining that it's at best unfair to other Hogwarts students and at worst kind of creepy. And I see it as similar to the issue with Hogwarts being unsafe. Like, yeah, if this were happening in the real world, I think this would probably be like an inappropriate teacher-student relationship. But in service of Harry's coming of age narrative, he kind of needs a wise older mentor to help him on his way. And with the people reading something sinister into it, I also just can't help but feel like there's some kind of latent homophobia there. Like, I know Dumbledore isn't written to be explicitly gay, but it's pretty common knowledge now that he is, and reading his interactions as creepy or predatory in any way just feels like a hell of a projection to me. The British wizarding economy and the American wizarding economy of the 1930s, as seen in the Fantastic Beasts franchise, at least appear to be capitalist. As with social systems like patriarchy, the economic systems of the wizarding West appear to be organized very similarly to the systems of the non-wizarding West. I think this is fine, personally. I don't think J.K. Rowling is particularly adept at complex world building, and she's at her best when she's playing a very simple game of what would the wizarding version of this conventional thing look like. That's why the fourth Harry Potter novel, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, was always my personal favorite. What would a Wizard Olympics look like, and what if we got the kids to play it? A flawless novel premise for 12-year-olds. 10 out of 10. No notes. Any kind of wizard economic system or magical commerce does beg some interesting questions, though. Like, can't you just cast a replication spell on anything you need? And if so, what would any economic system, much less a late 20th century capitalist system, look like in a truly post-scarcity society? Like, we're talking impossible levels of post-scarcity. Unless there are limits on replication spells or something. Like maybe you can replicate a burger, but it would sap all of the nutritional value from the food or something. So you can't actually sustain yourself on replicated food or whatever. I don't know, I'm just spitballing here. Joanne, please sound off in the comments if you have an answer to this very important question. Okay, let's dive into some of the troubling elements of the wizarding world of Harry Potter. Coming out swinging with one of the worst aspects of the wizarding world. So the house elves are a magical race of chattel slaves. The house elves are very clearly inspired by the brownies of Scottish folklore, who are usually described as ugly little hobgoblins or spirits, usually naked or wearing rags, who like to come out at night and do household chores while everyone is asleep. They're like these benevolent little fantasy creatures who just kind of like tidying. But they're also mischievous. So if you're lazy in your own chores, they might punish you by pinching you in your sleep or making a mess that you have to clean up. The brownies are usually tutelary spirits, meaning they usually attach themselves to one family, household, or geographic place, and are also described as quick to take offense. And if a person tries to baptize them or offer them clothing, they'll leave and never return. The house elves from Harry Potter are likewise ugly little hobgoblin creatures who belong to one family at a time and clean up after them because they are those families' slaves. Like the brownies, they wear scraps of rags instead of clothing, and in the universe of Harry Potter, if you offer a house elf an article of clothing, you set them free. So my guess is that J.K. Rowling liked the idea of the brownies, and with the character of Dobby, wanted to explore the idea of a brownie who doesn't actually like cleaning for people very much. A fine premise for a Disney, Pixar, or let's be honest, DreamWorks movie all on its own. However, brownies from folklore seem to have a lot of autonomy. Like a lot of guys I know, they'll straight up leave and never return if you try to get them to wear nicer clothes or challenge their atheism. So Rowling had to find a way to keep Dobby and the other house elves in positions of servitude in order for there to be any conflict for Harry and the gang to resolve. Thus, the slavery. But if house elves are indentured laborers, then we no longer have a story about a cheeky little house elf who doesn't want to clean your house. We have a story about a subjugated social caste, a people in need of liberation. Our boy wizard is rescued from his own terrible situation and whisked away to the wonderful world of witches and wizards, only to discover that a lot of what seems so wonderful and convenient about the wizarding world is maintained through a system of violence and subjugation. He must not only fight the existential threat of rising wizard fascism, but the injustice underpinning the entire system that promotes said fascism. Except that's not the story Joanne told. She still wanted to have Dobby the house elf that wouldn't. So she defined the race of house elves as a race of people that just really liked being servants. And Dobby was different because he just was. All of the other house elves love being enslaved. In fact, they need to be enslaved or they become depressed and directionless. When house elf Winky is set free, she becomes a depressed alcoholic. The they'll just turn to drink argument is one that conservatives like Jordan B. Peterson still use against things like UBI and disability and welfare payments, but it was also used as an argument against the emancipation of slaves in the United States. As was the argument that Black people were a race that were just genetically predisposed to enjoy serving whites. But Rowling's application of these same arguments to the house elves doesn't appear to be a clumsy allegorical reference to the historical transatlantic slave trade. I mean, unless her opinions are just way, way worse than I thought. She goes out of her way to demonstrate that the house elves really do just love being slaves by making Hermione, the wizarding world's sole abolitionist, this mid-2010s SJW cringe compilation character, who no one, including the people she's trying to help, really takes seriously. And in the end, no slavery is abolished. Only Dobby was freed and eventually employed at Hogwarts, where he was compensated with a sub-minimum wage and given 1 day off a month. The series is somewhat critical of the mean slave owners who do things like kick and insult their slaves, but really only when the mean slave owners are series antagonists, like the Malfoys. When Sirius Black and eventually Harry Potter himself are shitty to their house elf, Kreacher, it's framed as okay because Kreacher has bad vibes. Hey, while we're on the subject of magical racism, the issue of race within the sci-fi and fantasy genres has always been fraught. Way better writers than J.K. Rowling, and way worse ones, have stumbled over the depiction of fantasy and human races alike. The primary antagonist in the Harry Potter series is a fascist who would like to create a wizard ethno-state, so racial tension and racism are sort of integral to the plot. And it is handled poorly. The human characters, who are the sentient beings we spend the most time with, are divided up into the following racial classifications. Muggles, non-magical persons. Muggle-borns, witches or wizards with magical abilities but non-magical parents. Half-bloods, witches or wizards who are not pure-blooded but not muggle-born, purebloods, those with a complete magical pedigree, and squibs, non-magical persons born to magical parents. The wizarding community lives in isolation from the muggle community, and as a whole are kind of disrespectful and disdainful of muggles. The series' favorite big boy, Hagrid, uses the term muggle kind of like it's a slur.
I'd like to see a great muggle like you stop him.
He said that with a hard M. Despite the fact that Harry, Ron, and Hermione were seemingly cool with Hagrid running around dropping the M slur left and right, J.K. Rowling's framing of the racial divisions between humans and the wizarding worlds does seem to be largely critical. Again, her series' primary antagonist is Wizard Hitler. Rowling goes out of her way to show how muggle-born characters like Hermione and Harry's mother, Lily, are just as, if not more capable wizards than purebloods like the Malfoys or the Weasleys. And though I joked about muggle being the M slur a moment ago, there actually is a wizarding slur that begins with the letter M. Mudblood, referencing a half-blood's dirty blood. It's a very clear allusion to the one-drop rule of racial classification in the 20th century United States, and it's one of the preferred insults employed by antagonist and school bully Draco Malfoy. The racial classifications of witches and wizards are a little underexamined. Again, characters we are supposed to like are a little casually bigoted toward non-magical people, muggle and squib alike, in a way that doesn't get commented on or rectified. And we get to see how racial caste intersects with class somewhat. For example, the Weasleys are pureblood but are poor, so they aren't afforded the same privileges as other pureblood wizards. But we don't get to see how those wizarding castes intersect with other avenues of marginalization, like disability or the character's ethnicity. But Rowling's framing is, at least in the broadest strokes, critical of racism when it comes to the characters she perceives as human. The sentient, intelligent, non-human races are another matter entirely.
Halfway down the hall was a fountain. A group of golden statues, larger than life size, stood in the middle of a circular pool. Tallest of them was a noble-looking wizard with his wand pointing straight up in the air. Grouped around him were a beautiful witch, a centaur, a goblin, and a house elf. The last three were all looking adoringly up at the witch and wizard. Glittering jets of water were flying from the ends of the two wands, the point of the centaur's arrow, the tip of the goblin's hat, and each of the house elf's ears.
Ooh, that sounds a bit fashy, doesn't it? That's a description of the Fountain of Magical Brethren located in the Ministry of Magic before it was destroyed and replaced with the even more fashy Magic is Might statue. A little on-the-nose reference to the totalitarian credo, might is right. Dumbledore famously criticized what the Fountain of Magical Brethren represented in the Order of the Phoenix.
We wizards have mistreated and abused our fellows for too long, and we are now reaping our reward.
But the mistreatment of other magical races is mostly glossed over in the series, and doesn't really reach any kind of a satisfying conclusion. Within the world of Harry Potter, there are a plethora of fantasy creatures that, according to Newt Scamander, author of the in-universe book Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, and protagonist of the spin-off series, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, can be sorted into two main groups: beasts and beings. Already don't love the way that hits my ear. According to Rowling herself, a being is
any creature that has sufficient intelligence to understand the laws of the magical community and to bear part of the responsibility in shaping those laws.
You've got your ghosts, your goblins, your centaurs, your merpeople, your giants, etc. Notably, Newt Scamander does not mention house elves at all. Despite apparently being able to bear part of the responsibility in shaping magical laws, the only beings permitted to carry wands, the ultimate symbol of magical authority, are witches and wizards. No non-human magical being is permitted to carry a wand. Non-human magical beings are compelled to obey laws under a system in which they are legally recognized as second-class citizens. They are forbidden the privileges afforded to others based on race. And Dumbledore's comment about the wizards reaping their reward tragically doesn't mean there's some kind of non-human magical uprising and civil rights movement in the series, just that there's a serious question whether or not other sentient magical beings plan on helping the wizards, or whether they're going to defect and fight with Wizard Hitler trying to instate the wizard ethno-state. And it's like, yeah, they join sides with the wizards, who are still incredibly racist, but, aren't actively trying to build a wizard ethno-state. I guess I should also talk specifically about the goblins. The goblins are a big problem. So goblins in folklore are usually mischievous or even straight up malicious little guys, but they're kind of a blanket term covering a number of different trickster spirits like redcaps or pukwudgies. In fantasy like Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons, they're humanoid characters similar to orcs. And in Harry Potter, they're a secretive cabal of hook-nosed bankers who the wizarding community doesn't completely trust. The design of the goblins in Harry Potter are almost indistinguishable from the anti-Semitic propaganda that was coming out of Germany in the 1930s. The only goblin we come to know personally in the series is Griphook, who betrays Harry to Voldemort after Harry saves his life, illustrating that a goblin's only loyalty is to his money. Gross, Joanne! I don't really care what her actual intent was. I think it's pretty shocking that this was a decision that not only made it past an editor and into a book, but was reinforced by makeup, costume, and set designers in an eventual adaptation. This is beyond the pale.
How would you describe it?
The closest thing for my mind, is a Harry Potter story, because I read it. They got an island in Harry Potter, it says Azkaban, where there's no happiness. They just suck all your feelings out of you. And you don't have no feeling anymore. And truly, that's how I felt all the time, this is Azkaban. This is not from this world, because that's what they tried.
Azkaban is a wizarding prison on an island in the North Sea, kind of like Alcatraz in San Francisco. Get it? Azkaban, Alcatraz. And like Alcatraz, Azkaban is infamously difficult to escape. However, Azkaban has drawn more real-life comparisons to another American detention center, Guantanamo Bay. You see, Azkaban is not just a prison, but a torture facility guarded by creatures known as Dementors, which are like ring wraiths that feed on human happiness.
Dementors are among the foulest creatures that walk this earth. They infest the darkest, filthiest places. They glory in decay and despair. They drain peace, hope, and happiness out of the air around them. Get too near a Dementor and every good feeling, every happy memory will be sucked out of you. If it can, the Dementor will feed on you long enough to reduce you to something like itself, soulless and evil. You will be left with nothing but the worst experiences of your life, and you will just be an empty shell that lost its soul.
By simply being near the Dementors, a prisoner in Azkaban will have every good feeling or happy memory drained from them. And while most of the witches and wizards imprisoned in Azkaban are guilty of the most heinous crimes a magical person can commit — torture, murder, being a magical Nazi. Some are serving their time for crimes like illegal possession of exotic magical creatures or trapping their muggle neighbor in a teapot. Not that I think torture is acceptable for offenses like murder either, just that it feels like an especially out of proportion response to wacky hijinks involving an annoying neighbor in a tea set. Following Voldemort's downfall in the Second Wizarding War, oh my god, I'm just realizing that she literally called it WW2. Featuring Wizard Hitler. God damn it, Joanne! Following Voldemort's downfall in the Second Wizarding War, the Dementors were removed from Azkaban and replaced with Aurors, wizarding cops. Not because there were some kind of wizarding Geneva conventions, but because the Dementors chose to side with Voldemort in the war, so they all lost their jobs in the post-war period. Sad. Permeating throughout the Harry Potter series, there's this attitude of deference, but also detachment from wizarding institutions that is very unsettling. No one, not even our audience insert character Harry, is interested in knowing how anything works. Nobody is really that curious as to why or how magic works. I mean, no one is applying the scientific method to it. I guess if you find out how it works, it stops being magic and starts being science. But still, witches and wizards are just out here like, some people are magical and some people aren't, no one knows why. Oh well, guess we'll never know. And those same attitudes seem to infiltrate every aspect of wizarding culture. Like the main seat of government in the British wizarding world, the Ministry of Magic, seems to be pretty opaque and have very little, if any, checks and balances. An election for Minister of Magic, the Wizard Prime Minister, is held every 7 years, but individual ministers aren't bound by any term limits, and unelected Ministers of Magic can assume the ministry if they're just, special enough, as Albus Dumbledore apparently was. I don't know, it just seems like a system that's really easy to exploit. I mean, it was really easy to exploit, as evidenced by all the Death Eaters that did a silent coup. They didn't even have to establish their own dictatorship. There was one already there for them to dictate. But once they were vanquished, nothing really changed about the way the ministry functions. Just nicer people ascended to positions of power. Nobody really stopped to think about all the weaknesses within these institutions that made them especially easy targets for fascists. Nobody ever thought that the status quo needed to change, only that the goodest, bestest, nicest wizards should be the drivers and the primary benefactors of that status quo. Harry grows up and leaves Hogwarts and becomes an Auror, a wizard cop, the avatar, the chief enforcer of the status quo. And I think that's very revealing about both the personal politics of J.K. Rowling and also some of the more general neoliberal attitudes of the 1990s. But before we discuss that, I really gotta change the vibes in here. It's just feeling a little too British. That's better. Where was I? In the summer of 1989, when it was becoming clear that the Berlin Wall was about to become the Berlin landfill, American political scientist Francis Fukuyama published an essay titled The End of History? Drawing upon the works of Hegel and Marx, Fukuyama argued in his essay and eventually in his book, The End of History and the Last Man, that liberal democracy and capitalist markets are the final form of government and economic systems in all nations. The end of history moniker is a reference to Hegel's and Marx's definitions of human history as a progression from one socioeconomic system to the next, and not a claim that literally all historical events will stop. A misinterpretation of his work that Fukuyama hilariously had to address in October of 2001, when there were about 3,000 think pieces written about him that were like, "Your book didn't predict 9/11, checkmate, Liz." That's one think piece for every victim of 9/11. There were other, better criticisms of Fukuyama's arguments, of course. For example, one need only look at the way capitalism has thrived in authoritarian governments like China or backsliding democracies like Fukuyama's own home country, the United States, to see that the link he drew between capitalism and democracy is broken, and Fukuyama's own outlook has shifted somewhat in the intervening years. Fukuyama now supports something like the Nordic model, a mixed market system that still leans heavily on its own version of house elves in the global south, but which is such an overall improvement when compared to the US that to Americans like Francis Fukuyama, Copenhagen may as well be Hogsmeade. They have magic here! Some of it may be generated by slave labor, but look at all the whimsical architecture. Fukuyama's End of History is illustrative of a kind of liberal attitude that seeped into every aspect of culture in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. And I think it's an attitude that is very much felt in the Harry Potter series more generally, and also in J.K. Rowling's ultimate vision of the wizarding world. It also reminds me of another more obscure philosophical theory, Leibnizian optimism. Francis Fukuyama's End of History and The Wizarding World sans Voldemort have always reminded me of Gottfried Leibniz's The Best of All Possible Worlds theodicy, Vindication of God. If the question was, if God is benevolent, then why do bad things happen? Leibniz's answer was, bad things happen, and this is the best it can possibly get. Leibnizian optimism is most famous today for getting absolutely wrecked in Sigma male rationalist bad boy Voltaire's 1759 novel Candide. The central characters of the novel undergo a string of horrors, including being tortured by the Inquisition, contracting syphilis, having a butt cheek cut off by pirates, surviving a hanging, surviving being disemboweled, and of course, losing every earthly possession every single one of them had ever had. All the while, Candide's mentor, Professor Pangloss, a follower of Leibniz, continues to insist that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Echoes of Pangloss's thought-terminating cliché can be observed in both The End of History and in Harry Potter and Company's final vision for the wizarding world. The best of all possible wizarding worlds is one that is almost indistinguishable from the one we have now. One with slavery, a rigid and brutal system of racial hierarchy, public sanctioned torture facilities, capitalism, and a highly stratified class system. The only major difference seems to be that in Harry's world, everyone dresses like a 19th century pickup artist. And as low as my opinion of J.K. Rowling might be, I don't think that all of those horrible aspects of the wizarding world are a consequence of her tacitly endorsing them. Some of them sure are. But I think, as with Fukuyama and to an extent Leibniz, Rowling suffers from something of a lack of imagination. And maybe she clings on to a thought-terminating cliche or two. Please don't come for me, Harry Potter fans. I know she has demonstrated a lot of imagination when it comes to, like, Bertie Bott's every flavored beans or Quidditch or whatever else it is you guys go nuts for. But there are limits. There are blind spots in her imagination that lead to some problems in the writing. So I'm going to preface this entire section by saying writing is incredibly hard, and I'm not saying that Joanne is especially bad at it or that I could do any better, but Joanne's writing is not without its flaws, and I think that they're worthy of examining. I've been trying to give Joanne the benefit of the doubt this entire time when it comes to things like the magical race of slave people by trying to imagine what I think she might be attempting to do or reference as a writer and trying to identify what went wrong. Maybe I'm giving her a little too much credit or benefit of the doubt, but I'd rather err on the side of too much than too little personally. I'm a witch, not a witch hunter. Famously, Joanne wrote her Harry Potter books to grow up with the reader, and later entries in the series get darker and more complicated and longer than earlier entries. As a consequence of this, Joanne introduces a lot of elements to the story that I'm not sure she was prepared to resolve satisfyingly. Let's return again to this quote.
Halfway down the hall was a fountain. A group of golden statues, larger than life size, stood in the middle of a circular pool. Tallest of them was a noble-looking wizard with his wand pointing straight up in the air. Grouped around him were a beautiful witch, a centaur, a goblin, and a house elf. The last three were all looking adoringly up at the witch and wizard. Glittering jets of water were flying from the ends of the two wands, the point of the centaur's arrow, the tip of the goblin's hat, and each of the house elf's ears.
Joanne is clearly referencing real-world white supremacist statues here, and I believe she was trying to be critical of wizarding society and to illustrate the ways it already reflected Voldemort's vision of the world. But I don't think she knew how to undo it, other than just by putting characters that she assured us were the good guys in positions of power, either because of her own limitations as a writer or because of her personal politics. A similar setup that doesn't seem to pay off is Vernon Dursley being insistent on the magical and non-magical worlds being separate. The wizarding world is separate and hidden, and the wizards seem to want it that way too. But Harry's Uncle Vernon is a bad guy, and his distrust of magical people is used to illustrate what a horrible bigot he is. It feels like Harry's perspective of Uncle Vernon should lead him to, I don't know, convince the wizarding world to see that their own distrust of non-magical people is just the other side of the same coin, leading to some kind of change in the way the two worlds interact. And then Harry Potter's legacy is that of the guy who finally brought wizard-muggle unity and not just a child who lived through Voldemort trying to kill him twice. And I don't know, it just feels like you can't just resolve the story by merely defeating Voldemort anymore. Once you've introduced all of these problems in the status quo, you have to resolve the issues with the status quo, or at least comment on it in some kind of a satisfying way. Joanna said in a number of articles and interviews that she's very invested in exploring how different cultures interact and clash, and she tries to examine that through the house elves and the goblins in Harry Potter.
I am interested in what happens when cultural beliefs collide. Harry and Grifshook's disagreement over the sword is a clash of values without a solution, because each side has a different concept of what is right.
But she just isn't a nuanced enough writer to capture a realistic clash of cultures. Their disagreement is over who owns an item, the people who made it or the people who bought it. And the disagreement ends with Griphook selling Harry out to Wizard Hitler and getting killed. Like, that isn't a satisfying, nuanced exploration of different cultural beliefs. You're clearly meant to believe that one of those guys is an asshole. The one who sells out your series Christ figure. Good God, I can't get over the goblins. The Harry Potter novels were published around the time people were first congregating in online chat rooms, poring over every detail and pointing out every single plot hole. Now, I don't mind plot holes that much, when they're kind of trivial and when the story is good. Literally, who the fuck cares if there was enough surface area for Jack to fit on the door? It was about buoyancy. This is literally addressed in the movie, and even if it weren't, it would have been a much shittier movie if he'd lived. However, I think some of the online comments got to Joanne. In Book 3, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Joanne introduces the idea of the Time Turner, an enchanted object that can literally turn back time. The tutors at Hogwarts have let Hermione borrow the Time Turner so that she can study more classes, which is like a funny little bit, because Hermione's defining characteristic is that she's a big old nerd. It's a funny bit. She literally gets a time machine so that she can do more homework. But obviously the introduction of time travel means the introduction of a lot of logical problems for your story, which is why most stories with some form of time travel set firm limits for its use. So maybe Joanne could have introduced us to the Time Turner as an object that can only be used for trivial things, or that is pretty severe limitations on how far back in time it can take you, or whatever. But she didn't do that. The Time Turner is used in the climax of the story to literally save the lives of characters who were otherwise thought to have died. It was a powerful tool used to change the trajectory of the story. But in the fourth book, there are no Time Turners. They're never mentioned, and a child, Cedric Diggory, dies at the end of that book. So Joanne does two things that really feel like responses to people being annoying online about the stupid Time Turners. In the fifth book, Joanne included a scene in which the children are fighting wizard Nazis at the Ministry of Magic, and during the fight, they knock all of the Time Turners off of a shelf. All of them. All of the Time Turners in existence were all sitting on the same shelf, and they knocked over the Time Turner shelf. And the Time Turners get stuck on an infinite loop of time turning themselves and become completely unusable. It's so lazy and so funny. You can just hear her seething as she's writing it. The next thing she does is write the story that ended up being developed into the stage play Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, which revolves around Harry Potter's son getting a Time Turner and using it to save the life of Cedric Diggory, who then grows up to become a wizard neo-Nazi. Again, you can just feel the cope and seethe. Joanne really said, you can't save anyone else with the Time Turners because they're all gone, and even if they weren't gone, we'd all be worse off if you used one to save a child from being murdered. It's especially funny that she's so salty about using literal time travel to change the course of her story, because she absolutely loves retconning her story. One of the most common critiques of J.K. Rowling's writing is her incessant need to retcon or add paratextual details to the story. Sometimes this is just unnecessary world building, like tweeting out that wizards used to shit their pants and vanish the evidence, but other instances of Rowling's paratext leave an even worse taste in the mouth. Worse than poopy wizard pants. The most infamous example is, of course, the gaying of Albus Dumbledore. In the original Harry Potter series, there's no actual reference to Dumbledore's queerness, making Joanne's statements on his sexual orientation after the fact feel more like an attempt at scoring points than a sincere desire to depict and represent the queer community. But one could almost excuse Dumbledore's almost asexual presentation in Harry Potter. He was an old, single man throughout the entire series, and maybe he thought Hogwarts was an inappropriate venue to discuss details of his personal life. The 1990s were kind of a scary time to be a gay teacher, after all. Now is a scary time to be a gay teacher. Or maybe Dumbledore's queerness was something Joanne only realized after the fact. In fact, I'm almost certain this is the case, if she wasn't just making a side character gay in order to earn herself liberal brownie points. But the Harry Potter series isn't the only Wizarding Universe franchise where we see Albus Dumbledore. He's a central character in the Fantastic Beasts franchise, and his lover, Gellert Grindelwald, is the series' chief antagonist. We have been assured a hot lovers-to-enemies storyline, and we have been denied yet again. Grindelwald and Dumbledore's romance is less than subtextual. It's subatomic textual. Oh, sorry, that's scientific sounding. Their love affair is smaller and more fleeting than the wink of a bow truckle, and significantly less gay. Joanne's laziness when it comes to world building has gotten her into trouble. This map of the other wizarding schools pops up on Twitter every so often so that people can make fun of it. Mahuta Koro and Castelabruxo are what you would get if you entered the terms magic place and witch castle into Google Translate for Japanese and Portuguese, respectively. And as you can see, the continents of South America and Africa get one major wizarding school to serve students from hundreds of different cultures and languages, whereas schools like Hogwarts only serve the UK. Speaking of the African wizarding school, Ouagadougou, the WizardingWorld.com article on the school notes how African witches and wizards largely don't use wands. Kind of like the inferior races in British wizarding society. It's incredibly fucking weird, Joanne. Joanne's naming conventions have also drawn a lot of criticism. I mentioned the Google Translate wizarding schools, but a lot of her naming conventions are rooted in word association. The Killing Curse, Avada Kedavra, is similar to the magician's abracadabra. Vold is Danish for violence, and Mor is French for death, so you've got Voldemort. Your werewolf character is named Remus Lupin, Remus being one of the twins raised by wolves in the Roman myth of Remus and Romulus, and Lupin meaning wolf. And this sort of naming convention is repeated throughout a number of characters in the series, which makes it seem kind of weird when the black guy is named Kingsley Shacklebolt. A lot of people have also criticized the series' sole Asian character being named Cho Chang, which is just two different Asian surnames. I wonder what two words J.K. Rowling was thinking of when she came up with Cho Chang. Oh my god. We have so much to get to. Alright, I'm gonna start speeding through everything. J.K. Rowling's writing is laced with a disturbing amount of cruelty around fatness and fat people. The Harry Potter series suffers from a big, conventionally attractive equals good, ugly equals evil problem, but even in her detective series, the Cormoran Strike series, she uses fatness or obesity as a kind of visual shorthand for unsympathetic, foolish, stupid, or bad characters. Fat people trying to diet is played for laughs both in Harry Potter and in Cormoran Strike. One of J.K. Rowling's adult novels dedicates an entire paragraph to speculating over whether an obese man can see or wash or do anything with his penis, which is incredibly gross and unnecessary. The characters of Dudley and Vernon Dursley are probably the two fat Harry Potter characters with the most amount of time spent describing their fatness, especially Dudley, whose fatness is the physical manifestation of the Dursleys' overindulgence of him. Dudley is often described in dehumanizing terms. Several times he is literally compared to animals, like gorillas, killer whales, or pigs. Hagrid even gives him a pig's tail near the beginning of the first book. In her video essay, We Need to Talk About Dudley Dursley, YouTuber Okay to Be Fat notes that Dudley only experiences a small redemption arc in the series after he loses weight. They also point out that the stereotype of the fat bully who uses their size to intimidate smaller kids is a common trope in media, despite the exact opposite being true in reality. Fat kids are being bullied by thin kids. One study found that more kids identified being overweight as the reason they were being bullied than being queer or for their race or ethnicity. I can't imagine how hurtful it must have been to be a fat child and to read the Harry Potter series and see fatness equated with monstrousness. At least as an adult reading Joanne's adult work, you got a little context. Fat phobia has been a pretty common criticism of her work in the years since HP. But being a fat kid in the heroin-chic 1990s, trying to escape the real world into the fantastical world of witches and wizards, and still being demonized in the text of your fantasy Cinderella story, that had to be very painful for a lot of kids. And I'm sorry Joanne was and continues to be so needlessly cruel to fat people. A very interesting thing in light of J.K. Rowling's personal politics is how unsympathetic women in the Harry Potter series are often described as having masculine features, like strong jawlines or mannish hands. Joanne has always had some feelings about women who seem just a bit too mannish to her. Joanne's other biases also tend to seep into her work. Characters like Petunia Dursley, Dolores Umbridge, and Rita Skeeter, who wear makeup and bright feminine colors, are largely unsympathetic. But even characters who are not antagonists are mocked for their femininity. Lavender Brown, a Gryffindor student, is a continual punchline in the books and movies just for acting like a typical girly teenager. Emma Lord writes for Bustle,
"The problem isn't Lavender Brown herself, but the way Lavender Brown is presented to the audience, through the lens of Ron and Hermione. Ron doesn't hesitate to call her crazy, among other unkind implications, even when he is the one actively avoiding her, thereby justifying her frustration with him. Hermione is similarly dismissive or downright rude in the way she reduces Lavender Brown as someone lesser, just because they have diverging interests. The real kicker here, though, is because of this lens, when we think of Lavender Brown, we don't think of her loyalty or her bravery. We don't think of the fact that she joined Dumbledore's army and died a gruesome and valiant death at the Battle of Hogwarts. We don't consider her dreams, her passion, her enduring friendships at Hogwarts. Instead, we think immediately of her teenage crush on Ron Weasley. This girl was reduced to nothing more than a punchline by the time the movies were finished with her, all as a plot device meant to elevate the sexual worthiness of a man.
It's notable that femininity gets a pass when you're motherly. Within the Harry Potter series, motherhood is heavily romanticized as the best and most heroic act a woman can ascend to. Even Narcissa Malfoy gets a nice little redemption arc because she's such a good mommy. Molly Weasley, a housewife, is able to overcome Bellatrix Lestrange, a powerful dark witch, through the power of motherhood. And Bellatrix is reduced to the screeching, deranged woman subservient to a powerful man. The only exception that proves the motherhood rule in Harry Potter might be Petunia Dursley, whose overindulgence of Dudley is like a perversion of the kind of pure motherly love depicted in characters like Lily Potter, Molly Weasley, and Narcissa Malfoy. Many of the female characters just feel like set dressing. Like, what the fuck is Ginny Weasley? She's the most boring cardboard love interest for Harry. Her interests are Harry, dating other guys to show she has interests outside of Harry, and getting rescued by Harry. I am just begging for a crumb of personality. It's terribly disappointing that an author who seems so invested in the aesthetic of feminism gives us very few interesting female characters. You've got Hermione and Luna Lovegood, just like Monica and Phoebe from Friends. Thanks, Joanne. Some of the problems in the writing I just mentioned can be chalked up to talent or bad artistic choices or whatever, but Joanne Rowling's work is infused with her personal politics. Joanne is a centrist Blairite neoliberal. She's a personal friend of former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who even has his own wiki page on the Harry Potter wiki. Very weird stuff. J.K. Rowling is a centrist and a second-wave feminist who is very invested in the idea of being a good person. She likes to claim that her books are anti-authority and anti-bigotry, even if a close examination of them reveals them to be a little less anti-authority and anti-bigotry than they're hyped up to be. She's very well known for her charitable giving, famously falling off the Forbes billionaire list in 2012 for giving so much of her enormous wealth away. In an article for The Telegraph, she was quoted as saying,
"I think you have a moral responsibility when you've been given far more than you need to do wise things with it and give intelligently.
Whether she has regained billionaire status is the subject of some dispute, as her team seems to have gotten really good at hiding her net worth since she made the Forbes billionaire list the first time. I think Joanne's centrism feeds into her kind of individualist view of the world. So when she presented her story with systemic problems, she could really only imagine these kind of myopic, meritocratic solutions to them. The solution to slavery is to replace all the bad slave owners with nice ones. And I think her self-perception as a good person has led her to be a little hostile toward criticisms of some of her blind spots and missteps. Joanne has a very individualist, black and white sense of good and bad, and since she knows herself to be a good person who does nice things like give to charity, people telling her that she has done bad things just doesn't compute. I'll give an example. Rowling once said,
"Fat is usually the first insult a girl throws at another girl when she wants to hurt her." I mean, is fat really the worst thing a human being can be? Is fat worse than vindictive, jealous, shallow, vain, boring, or cruel? Not to me, but then, you might retort, what do I know about the pressure to be skinny? I'm not in the business of being judged on my looks. What with being a writer and earning my living using my brain.
I don't think Joanne realizes that in very many cases, she's the girl calling people fat. Joanne doesn't think of herself as fat-phobic at heart, and so she doesn't recognize the fat phobia in her actions. Joanne thinks of herself as a feminist, so she doesn't recognize the misogyny in her work. Joanne thinks of herself as a champion of queer people. So we've come to the transphobia. The TLDR for anyone blessed enough to not have spent as much time on Twitter over the last few years as I have is that Joanne first drew the attention of the queer community a few years ago by liking a few tweets of prominent transphobes. This was first written off as an accident, a little senior moment on the part of Joanne, who just accidentally liked a bunch of transphobic tweets while she was scrolling through her feed. Fine. But then she started to follow some prominent transphobes and like a few more of their tweets. And then in December of 2019, she tweeted out her support for Maya Forstater, a virulent transphobe whose consulting contract with a global think tank was not renewed following her creating a hostile work environment for trans coworkers. So as far as the queer community was concerned, J.K. Rowling had completely outed herself as a big old transphobe. But just in case there was any doubt, Joanne tripled down in June of 2020 when she published a 3,000-word essay to her website titled Turf Wars. The essay was full of transphobic stereotypes. I mean, she just set aside the dog whistles and chose foghorns. So Joanne is a confirmed member of the gender-critical community, and a lot of queer people were hurt by this. Regardless of the series' problems, Joanne wrote a story about a boy trapped in a literal closet, discovering that the very thing that made him weird and different, that made his family treat him cruelly and with suspicion, that made it difficult to relate to other children was the one thing that made him special. She wrote a Cinderella story about him being whisked away to a world that loved and celebrated him for who he is. And that meant a lot to many, many queer kids. For countless children, Harry Potter was an escape from bullying, from a troubled home life, from their own sense of incongruity. And for so many queer and trans Potter fans, Rowling's comments felt like a personal betrayal. Writer Aya Romano cited the Harry Potter series as being one of the first pieces of media that made them realize they were non-binary. In an article for Vox following the publication of Turf Wars, Aya wrote,
I vividly remember the visceral excitement I felt the first time I read the fifth Harry Potter book in 2003 and met Nymphadora Tonks, a shapeshifter with spiky pink hair, a punk rock aesthetic, and an insistence on being called by her gender-neutral last name. I was certain that Rowling had written a canonically gender-fluid character. Like millions of other Harry Potter fans who dared to project ourselves into the books, I was ultimately disappointed. By the end of the series, Tonks was a married, fully binary woman, softer and gentler, letting her husband feminize her as Dora, a name she'd previously hated. I have always wondered if Rowling set up Tonks to be somehow tamed in the later books, from her earlier non-binary presentation in Order of the Phoenix, and I've always written it off as surely not conscious. As a sickening byproduct of Rowling's transphobic screed on Wednesday, I now realize I was right to have been wary all along. Rowling argues in the essay for the scientifically flawed and emotionally abusive narrative that gender dysphoric teens will grow out of their dysphoria, and uses herself as an example of a teen who felt mentally sexless before eventually, fortunately, growing out of feeling confused, dark, both sexual and non-sexual. I read this passage as a chilling, heartbreaking confirmation that Rowling wrote Tonks not as an affirmation, even a subconscious one, of trans identity, but as a conscious repudiation of it. She deliberately created Tonks as a dysphoric individual so that the character could grow out of her dysphoria, steadily perpetuating the transphobic narrative that gender dysphoria is a choice. She consciously created the shape-shifting non-binary character who helped me figure out well into adulthood that I was genderqueer, and then made her grow into being cisgender.
Art is personal. When we ask ourselves, is Harry Potter bad? The secret question we're really asking is, am I bad if I still love Harry Potter? And I don't know how to answer that. Engaging with the global franchise, Harry Potter, trademark, necessarily increases the wealth of a woman who has a lot of power and influence, and who is making the world less safe for a lot of my loved ones. But I can't deny the role it has played in shaping people's lives. If you were a young queer kid and Harry and his friends were what first made you feel safe or hopeful or euphoric, if it was the first series that made you excited to read and engage with art, I'm not going to be the one to take that from you. And you know what? Joanne can't either. You're allowed to have complicated feelings about this. You're allowed to feel the hurt and the anger and the betrayal, and also the joy and the love. You're allowed to protect the things that are meaningful to you, even if now you see them in a different light. Even now that they've revealed to you that they aren't what you thought they were. Just like, try not to give her your money. Buy the books secondhand and buy unlicensed merch by independent artists on Etsy. And pirate the movies in Minecraft.